How is it possible for a company to have 450 employees and still be independent? And why is it so important that that company is independent when it comes to Larian Studios and the success of Baldurs Gate 3? Well, those are the two questions I'm going to answer in this video. Hi, I'm Mugthief. Stop telling me to take care of my hair. It's a wig, it's not real hair. Let's get into it. Every time I've brought up the topic of Larian being independent and how that's so critical to Baldurs Gate 3's development and its success, there are inevitably people fighting and saying that no, they're not. Baldurs Gate 3 is a AAA game, as if those two things are mutually exclusive. It also frequently ends with a knife fight in the comments section. But the fact of the matter is that Larian is independent. And the definition of independent in games development really has to do with exactly what the word says. Do they depend on somebody else for their decision making? You see, even super small indie teams maybe aren't indie. They're not independent at all, because by the definition that we just established, a lot of their decisions could be compromised or affected by other parties, namely publishers. So why is that independent so crucial? So let's take that example of a small indie studio who then signs on with a publisher who is going to recommend them things to do on their game. Normally, publishers will not only just publish the game, but also help out in game development with a ton of different things. These can range from quality assurance to localization to marketing and so many other things. Within that QA and feedback, there could be some things that pressure the studio to change parts of the game or to gear it more in one direction or another. How much of that happens really depends on the publisher and on the studio. For a good view of this, you can even see Videogame Dunkey, who recently started up their own publisher, BigMode, or Asmongold and OTK's Mad Mushroom. The idea behind these publishers, in theory, is to support these games with all of the things that a publisher should without meddling with the final result unless it's really for the better. You can imagine that other publishers might push into the realm of censorship or straying away from controversy, making the game as apt for everyone as possible, whatever their definition of that may be, and even influence the price and monetization that is put into the game. Some of these things don't have to come from the publisher either. Temtem, the live service Pokemon-like that you can buy on Steam, has some really scummy monetization tactics with its pay-to-win battle pass that has received plenty of backlash. That game is published by Humble Bundle, who normally stays away from these sorts of things. Is it the developer's fault or is it Humble Bundle's fault? We don't know, but it's easy to assume it could be either. We don't have to blame the publisher for that. The most common example of how your independence can be compromised as a studio is by being in a publicly traded company. If you're a studio under one of these behemoths like EA, Ubisoft, or Activision Blizzard, we're gonna talk a lot about them in a video next week, you report to the shareholders. So the people who hold the most sway over the company are people that are technically just investors, and they are the ones demanding higher and higher profits. That pressure from the top to earn more and more every single quarter trickles down into decisions like what projects to invest in. So we should never focus on new IP because it's proven that existing IP sells better. If you're going to make a game, you better make sure that it makes a ton of money. And if you're unsure if it's going to make a ton of money, then redirect it into something that could by adding live services and microtransactions and all sorts of other ways to further the revenue from a game. I think the relationship in those circumstances is really clear how not being independent really does affect the creative vision of each and every team under that umbrella. Now, something I see quite often is that Larian is not independent because Tencent owns 30% of the company, while Sven Vink and his wife own the other 70%, Sven Vink being the founder and also the director of Baldurs Gate 3. Some people say, how is it possible that Tencent owns 30% of the company if it's not publicly traded? And the answer is just by investing. You can own part of any private company as long as they're willing to sell. However, because it's not a publicly traded company, that means that that investment agreement goes under your terms when you decide to sell it. Just the same as if you take on any debt to fund a project. At the end of the day, while it's possible that a private investor could hold some voting power in a company, that's only if under the agreements that company has settled, it gives those shareholders or investors the right to vote or to do anything really. Especially considering that Tencent is a Chinese company that spends a ton of money investing in a ton of different places, including the video game space quite often, it's safe to assume that Tencent's investment in Larian is not with the intention of changing any of the content within Baldur's Gate 3 to suit the Chinese market. Because if you've played Baldur's Gate 3, you know that to make this game suit the censorship that is required to launch a game in China would mean making a completely different game. There's basically something around every corner that is prohibited. But even beyond the evidence that that investment is not for the Chinese market and just financial, we should really trust Sven Vink and the rest of Larian when they say they are independent despite this. This just means that, hey, Tencent wanted to own part of this company because they considered it a good investment, and Sven valued having that money. An agreement on their terms where that doesn't influence anything that they do at all, which, as I said before, definitely seems to be the case. I've also heard people say that if you have any debt at all, that means that you're no longer independent, because the way that you're going to work and your release dates and your prices are all going to be dependent on that debt that you have and when you need to pay it. But the truth is that you only lose your independence if you took on bad debt. Larian Studios, precisely being, a really big studio that's been around the block when it comes to releasing big games and self-publishing them more than once, definitely understands what a good deal and what good debt and bad debt are. If you as an individual take on debt, for example, you go to the bank and ask for a loan, yes, you now have an obligation to pay the bank depending on the deal that you struck with them. But they don't condition anything else. The bank can't tell you, well, now you better go to work more often. Why don't you go to work 80 hours instead of 40? They can't do that. The only thing that is in that agreement is that you need to pay this money by this date. And if you know how to program that loan in a way that's not going to affect you, then it doesn't really condition anything. That's not to say it couldn't. Of course, if you get into a bad one, it can definitely condition what you do. I'm quite certain, whether we know it or not, that plenty indie studios have released into early access to probably make some money because they had to deal with some debt, or even just to have a product out there and start generating some revenue because of their investors. But all of those deals are behind closed doors and people normally don't talk about them. But once again, the proof is in the pudding. When we look at Baldur's Gate 3, it really doesn't have the telltale signs of that. It released into early access 3 years before the final launch with a very transparent message of getting the game into people's hands, obtaining money and funding off of the trust of those fans, and getting some testing done. A plan, by the way, that many AAA companies wouldn't support. They then continued to delay the game until they finally released it, and I think the quality of the game speaks for itself. It's in a lot of the choices that Baldur's Gate 3 makes to be an excellent game that we see that independence shine. I already did a video that you can watch here or here, I don't know, listing 7 things that I think Baldur's Gate 3 does incredibly well. And I think all 7 of those would be much harder to do if you didn't have full independence and creative control. A game with oversight from anyone else, specifically, investors, shareholders, or anybody that could make the studio dependent, wouldn't allow Larian to spend as much time to delay the game and to put in as many resources as it has in things like missable content, because it just doesn't make business sense. Some people go as far as to say that the game's unfinished state and buggy Act 3 are because they needed to rush the game out the door, because they probably had debts that they needed to pay, because they're not independent, which to me really comes off as a comment of somebody that has never worked in any creative field ever. As a person who's worked extensively in music and in the music industry, the truth is that in the music field, if we had unlimited budget and unlimited time, we would never release a song. We would never publish anything because nothing is ever perfect. We always want our projects to be the absolute best representation, in our opinion, of what they could be. But at the end of the day, not because of money, but because you need to move on, you end up releasing something. That release can be exceptional or pretty good, and it can be a hit, or it can be listened to by nobody. But you have to let those projects go at some point, because you just end up in a bubble where you keep developing and developing that idea. The studio compromised on what they considered to be a good state for the game to launch, where they considered it to be content and feature complete. Even if some things are missing or are going to be corrected afterwards, it's very probable that without ever releasing it, they would never know. And if you think that what's in the game is not good enough, I think that the overwhelmingly positive that it has listed on Steam right now is proof that it is. I'm sure somebody's gonna say, not all of those players that reviewed it have finished the game, and towards the end is where it's bad. Then look at the critics' reviews, because I guess it's more likely that they finished it, and it's their job to know the industry and evaluate it. And it's the highest scoring game of the year, and the game of the year for a reason. Even if it isn't perfect, you can't go around blaming that to Larian isn't truly independent. So yes, the secret sauce that allows Baldur's Gate 3 to be as special as it is in large part due to that creative independence. The fact that the studio has to compromise a lot less than most to get the game out the door. They can retool it and refocus it and rewrite it and invest a lot of effort and passion and money into things that other studios aren't able to do for one reason or another. And it turns out that a lot of those things are really what makes the difference between a very good game and an exceptional game that we will talk about for years to come. It shows a spotlight on just how terrible the current system is, with publicly traded companies especially suffering from that pursuit of more and more money and the eternal greed of the people at the very top, even if probably people that are a little bit lower or middle managers or even studio heads understand that creativity and passion makes good games and good games make more money. But that just isn't allowed for those people. Keep in mind, that isn't always the case, and I've said it before that there are plenty of studios under giant corporate umbrellas, including all of Nintendo studios, most of Sony's first-party efforts, and examples in a ton of places, including the devil incarnate, EA, with things like Dead Space and Jedi Survivor this year, which I guess are just getting financed thanks to Apex Legends. Sometimes these miracles happen. Sometimes studios are allowed to execute on their creative vision no matter the circumstances. It's just that an independent studio like Larian can really push that to its limit before releasing a game. Hey there, Editing Mugthief here. Since I know somebody's gonna bring it up, what about From Software? From Software is owned at around a 70% by the Kadokawa Corporation, and then a 15% from Sony Interactive Entertainment and 15% from Tencent. That means that From Software owns 0% of itself, so no, definitely not independent at all. That falls into the miracles category. I hope that this video puts to rest this idea that Larian isn't an indie studio, because indie doesn't mean 4 people making a game in a garage with pixel graphics. Independent really just does mean that you don't have to concern yourself with other factors that could affect your development. A lot of what I'm talking about here was already mentioned by Jason Schreier on a piece he did for Bloomberg, which if I have to keep citing, I might as well just put it as my channel banner. If you thought this video was interesting, you learned something, it gave you something to think about, hit the like button. That way, this video reaches more people. If you want more content like this, from news, reviews, and commentary, hit the subscribe button. I have some absolutely fantastic videos that I'm really excited about coming out very soon. I've been Mugthief, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the internet.